to. There are actually a number of people who do watch the recording. I have no idea how long, like, do they watch it just for 1 minute? So like last week, 35 people viewed the recording of class. So
I did. I did because I couldn't see it real time. And I
right.
had a lot of questions, but I couldn't ask.
Yes, that's the frustrating thing when you watch the recording, you can't ask the questions. So, okay, so I'm going to mute everybody. And so if you have a question, just unmute yourself and feel free to interrupt at any time. So this week we end the book of Numbers with the double portions of Mattot-Massei, and just letting in one more person. Diane has joined, and I'm just, okay, everybody's muted. Okay, so we have the double portions of Mattot-Massei. If you're in Eitz Chaim, it begins on page 941. Any other edition of the Chumash that you have, or the Bible, you're looking at Numbers chapter 30, beginning with verse 2. So again, this gets into just the difference between how the rabbis divided up the Torah into portions versus how the church fathers divided up the Bible into chapters and verses. So chapter and verse comes from the Christian world, and Torah portions obviously come from the Jewish world, and it's sometimes pretty, it's just off-putting or kind of weird, just as we look through the Chumash with chapter and verse to see why is the portion beginning with verse 2. Well, it makes sense to start the portion here because Vayidaber Moshe el Rashi Hamatot, Livnei Yisrael Lemor. Moses spoke to the heads of the Israelite tribes, the heads of the tribes of the children of Israel. That would be the more literal translation, saying. So it makes sense that a new topic is starting here. Why, when it was divided into chapter and verse, the chapter didn't end. Well, see, if we look back at the end of the portion Pinchas, back on 936 in the Eitz Chaim, we see that that's chapter 29 leading into chapter 30, verse 1. So you could see, if you're looking just very quickly, if you're like the person who's just working to divide up into chapters and verses, you have verse 39 saying, Eile ta'asu la'Adonai b'mo'adechem, levad minidrechem v'nidvotechem la'olotechem v'uleminchotechem uleniskechem uleshalmechem v'yomer Moshe el b'nei Yisrael kechol asher tziva Adonai et Moshe. So that all these you shall offer to the Lord at the stated times, in addition to your votive and free will offerings, be they burnt offerings, grain offerings, libations, or offerings of well-being. So Moses spoke to the Israelites just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So it seems obvious, and the English makes it so by translating it, so Moses spoke, to say that that line is like a summation of the whole chapter, and it's a conclusion to it. But whoever was dividing it saw the Vayomer Moshe and said, hey, that starts a new topic. But then the very next verse, which is our portion on 941, has Vayidaber Moshe el Rashi. So why would there be a Vayomer Moshe in that verse, and then the next one, Vayidaber Moshe? So it seems clear the Vayomer Moshe ends the portion, and the Vayidaber Moshe starts a new portion. And the rabbis had it right, and whoever made the chapter and verse got it wrong. You would think that they would have had editors with the chapters and verse so that they could have changed their mind, but it's just it's just fascinating how that all came to be. So with that tangent about why the Torah portion begins with verse 2, I want to look below the line to begin our discussion today. As we approach the end of the book of Numbers, the focus shifts to the settlement of the land of Israel. This parsha begins with a series of regulations emphasizing the seriousness of oaths and vows, and then describes the battle against Midian. So we'll get into both of those this morning. Next is a request by two of the tribes to settle in the choice grazing land outside the designated borders of the promised land. Not sure that we'll have time to get there. These chapters, with their promise of the people Israel settling the land God swore to give them, are always read in the weeks before Tisha B'Av, a day when we mourn the destruction of the temple and the beginning of the exile. So here, so most of the time, Mattot and Massei are read together. That depends on the calendar as to whether Mattot and Massei would be separated. But it's the portions, either as separate portions or together, are always read during this period of time known as the 3 weeks between the fast day of the 17th of Tammuz and the fast day of the 9th of Av. So those 3 weeks in which we're mourning the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the subsequent exile of our ancestors from the land of Israel, it is heartbreaking to read about settling the land, but it's the idea someday we'll get back to Israel. And obviously the state of Israel is reestablished, but religiously, for traditionalists, the idea is that we're still in exile. We're waiting for the Messiah to come to bring us back to the land of Israel. So by reading these portions during the 3-week time in the calendar, it's the idea is of hope and prayer that someday we'll get back to Israel and we'll be able to settle the land and to live there as one entire Jewish community in the way that the Torah is describing it here. So that's the homiletical connection with Tisha B'Av. And so the commentary goes on. The Bible, so wait, before we go on, we want to read now what the beginning of the portion talks about to get a sense of what the commentary is reacting to. So on 941 above, in the portion itself, Moses spoke to the heads of the Israelite tribes, saying, "This is what the Lord has commanded. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. He must, I'm just looking at the Hebrew, that imposing an obligation on himself is the Hebrew le'asor isar. So he must carry out all that has crossed his lips. If a woman makes a vow to the Lord or assumes an obligation while still in her father's household by reason of her youth, and her father learns of her vow or her self-imposed obligation and offers no objection, all her vows shall stand, and every self-imposed obligation shall stand. But if her father restrains her on the day he finds out, none of her vows or self-imposed obligations shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her, since her father restrained her." Now, two things about this. First, the sexist orientation here about how a woman, an unmarried woman who's still living at home, has to be dependent upon her father for certain things, not just for vows, but for a woman. And we know this from the book of Ruth, and we know this from other places in the Bible. We know this from rabbinic law as well, that a woman is subject to either her father or her husband. And when a woman becomes a widow, that is, then she, or a divorcee, she's in a very precarious position, because her father doesn't necessarily have to take her back if she's a divorcee or a widow. And if she's not married, then how is she going to sustain herself? So people are sustained by their property. Women don't own their own property. So therefore, how are women able to sustain themselves? So they either are sustained by their fathers or their husbands. And if they're a widow, they're sustained by whatever was agreed upon in the ketubah, and that would be her inheritance. And then her children, which would be her husband's children, but they are her children too, might say, okay, we'll be nice and we'll support mom in her widowhood. But if she were to get remarried, then her children, her biological children, would no longer have to sustain her. Her new husband would take care of her. So in our day and age, this all sounds, what is the word? Not nice. I'm trying to think of something more profound to say about that, but it's clearly sexist. Clearly, women are second-class citizens, and depending upon how we understand the laws themselves, women are technically property. They are not human beings in their own right to be able to survive on their own. So there are exceptions to this in the Torah and in rabbinic literature, but those exceptions prove the rule that women are subject to either their father or their husband. So that's point number one that our portion takes for granted. And we learned that in last week's portion too, with the daughters of Tzalafchad, when Moses was saying, here is the land and how it's going to be apportioned by tribes and by families, and how it can be passed down. Those ancestral plots will be passed down from father to son. The 5 daughters, they don't have a brother, come to Moses saying, but what about us? Our father died in the desert. Shouldn't he have his plot in Israel that we can that we can claim in his name? And Moses has to go to God, and God says and teaches the entire people, in this situation, when there are no sons, then a daughter can inherit. But that's a problem, because the way inheritance works is that the sons maintain the family plot from one generation to the next. If a daughter gets it, well, then a daughter would be getting it for her husband. And if her husband is from a different tribe, then you're bringing in a different tribe and a different family into your family plot. So the technical fine print of that law was that those 5 daughters who are of the tribe of Menashe had to agree to marry Menashe men. So at least the land holding would stay within the tribe of Menashe, and you won't be bringing in some other tribe into the tribal area of Menashe. Okay, so it still complicates and reinforces the rule that women are second-class citizens. The other aspect here is this whole bizarre idea of vows and oaths that people take. And we really don't take this so seriously today. I mean, the classic circumstance where we take vows are in court. So if anybody serves as a witness or testifies in court, then you're swearing on the Bible or in God's name, or if you're an atheist, you're affirming that you're telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if you're not an atheist, so help me God. So that's a formula in which you are taking a vow or an oath. But in rabbinic times and in biblical times, people would be taking oaths on a more regular basis. And I really don't know, I'm not up on all the laws, but there's a whole tractate of the Talmud dealing with oaths. The tractate Shavuot, not Shavuot, the holiday, which means Shavua is week, W-E-E-K. Shavuah, that's still shin, bet, vav, ayin, with a hey at the end, with the two dots under the shin, not the T vowel or the straight line vowel. The two dots makes it a different word, and a shavuah is an oath. Here we have a neder, which is a vow. So a vow or an oath are similar things. You're taking God's name in order to say something. A vow is you're taking God's name to promise to do something in the future. Like, if such and such happens, then I will do such and such. Or it doesn't have to be necessarily an if-then kind of formula. It could be, I vow that I will donate such and such to the temple. Or I vow that I don't know, bring a sacrifice for the next several days to the temple. Something like that. Those vows become operative as soon as one uses God's name. And there's a particular formula. I'm not familiar with the formula. There's a particular word formula for taking a vow or an oath. Oaths would be taken in court. And we've seen in Talmud class how the rabbis try their best not to have people take oaths in court because they don't want people to lie. And the rabbis like to assume that people won't lie, but they know that people being people, they might lie. And if they lie, then they're taking God's name in vain, and they could be executed for having taken God's name in vain. If you make a false oath, then you are punished severely for taking God's name in vain. So all this idea of vows and oaths, the only thing that we have left Jewishly from this is Kol Nidre. So that formula at the beginning of the service on the first night of Yom Kippur, as Yom Kippur is beginning, and we're not going to be doing this year, of taking the Torah scrolls out of the ark and having the presidents and past presidents of the congregation holding the Torah scrolls on the bima. We're not going to be able to do that this year, but that is to represent witnesses before God in this holy, sacred tribunal that we are convening, that we are annulling vows that we may take, and that's what the commentary is going to get to, that we may take in this coming year that we may not fulfill. So it's a bizarre formula that most of us don't read the English translation. We get caught up in the music. So you have a beautiful musical setting to what is essentially a legal formula. So if you have, imagine, some commercials that you have on TV or on the radio, especially on the radio, when the announcer then at the end reads something very fast, what is that called? There's a technical term for the disclaimer. The disclaimer at the end of the commercial, what you're doing very fast. So imagine doing that disclaimer to the music of Kol Nidre, because that's exactly what we're doing, right? So imagine, I don't know, Sharei Tefillah is not liable if anyone gets COVID-19. Like doing the Kol Nidre tune to a disclaimer or a waiver like that seems ridiculous. But that's exactly what we're doing with Kol Nidre, that we're saying, I'm pulling the Machzor out, and let me just get to the beginning of Kol Nidre quickly here. I have different things here in my book. Just a second, I'll get there. The wording just in our Machzor, the new Machzor, all vows, renunciations, bans, oaths, formulas of obligation, pledges, and promises that we vow or promise to ourselves and to God from this Yom Kippur to the next, may it approach us for good, we hereby retract. Okay, now, I'm sure many of us have read this in the English and try to figure it out. And that's why on this page in the Machzor, you have all the commentary on both the right and the left-hand side to try to explain what this is all about and to offer other alternatives to be said at this time. So it reflects the idea that how serious vows were taken, and that if we are on Yom Kippur is all about asking God for forgiveness, the very first thing we're asking forgiveness for is an oath that we might not be, or a vow that we might not be able to follow up on. So let's look below the line and see what our editors of this commentary says about this as well. The Bible stresses the power and solemnity of words from the opening verses of the Torah, in which God creates a world with words, to the commandment to distance oneself from falsehood, that's one of the 10 commandments, to the repeated emphasis against insulting the convert or the physically handicapped. There are those in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19. This emphasis continued in post-biblical Judaism. So words take on an important element in our interactions with other people. So in other words, it's not just about acts that we perform or things that we do physically to other people that could get us in trouble, or could be a mitzvah if we do the right thing. So it's not just physical actions that we do, but there are words too. So, human beings are the only animals that have speech, and that speech can actually hurt someone, can offend, insult, and actually emotionally damage people. So yes, Jan, go ahead, unmute yourself.
It doesn't really sound surprising if it is that when the Torah was written, there was such care to every single word and the way that each word was written and which word was chosen. Well, it was chosen that it could have been this or this, but they chose this specifically. And there was so much attention paid to not just telling the story or sharing the information, but with such care to every word that it's not so surprising that now as we follow the guidelines of the Torah, that we too should be so careful about exactly which words we use or don't use, or how we describe, that we should also be so mindful about our word choice.
No, I totally agree with you, Jan, and certainly it's the entire Yom Kippur service. One of the key prayers is the Al Chet, a long list of sins. Al Chet shechatanu lefanecha, and we bang our chests for each one in these series, and it's in alphabetical order, and there are 2 sins for each letter of the alphabet, plus a few extra thrown in, and a majority of those sins that we are asking God for forgiveness for are sins related to speech. So gossip, libel, lying, etc., etc. Anything we can imagine that we do with words. So there's that, and the idea that we want to pray the right words, and we want prayers to be recited by us with our words in the most effective way possible. My only argument about that, not an argument, my only challenge from the text about vows and oaths is that we're just not so familiar with vows and oaths today as we are with other forms of speech. So, and I would argue what the kind of speech that's on Twitter and other social media, how people talk to each other through the words that are used on Facebook, blogging, podcasts, op-eds in the newspaper, just randomly throwing out words. And the op-ed contributor to the New York Times who just resigned yesterday, Barry Weiss, reflecting in her resignation letter the bullying, the verbal bullying that she says that she was subjected to, not just anti-Semitism, but also for her political perspective. All of that that's what we think about with words and speech today. The whole idea of vows and oaths that the Torah is bringing up is that's kind of foreign to us. But certainly speech in general, that's not foreign to us. And that's, the idea that we're supposed to take our words seriously as if we are invoking God's name when we say these things, that if we all thought that way, then society would be a lot better off. Because if we invoked God's name before, while we tweet, I shouldn't say we, while people tweet, because I don't tweet. But if the Twitter world out there is full, and it's even, you're restricted, well, you used to be restricted to 140 characters. I think they expanded that now to a little bit more, but still, you would think you have to think about what you're writing on Twitter, and people are still being offensive in that way, and you got all these kinds of emojis that you can add that could also be offensive. We should apply these laws about vows and oaths to how we speak today. Saul, did you want to ask something? Because you unmute. No. Okay. All right. So let's go on. So what the commentary is pointing out is that the Torah was the world, the universe, the world was created with words to point out how enormously powerful words can be, right? Because every day of the 6 days of creation, God spoke, and then something came into being. There wasn't an action that God did. What God was doing was speaking, and then the water separated from the land. God spoke, and the stars and the moon and the sun appeared. And God spoke, and fish were created, etc., etc. So the power of words. So it goes on. This emphasis continued in post-biblical Judaism. A word is not merely a sound. It is real. It has substance with the power to hurt or to heal, to elevate or to denigrate. The seriousness with which the Torah takes vows and promises is the basis of the words with which the service begins on the eve of Yom Kippur, right? Which was, I was pointing out, with those words, Kol Nidre, we declare that any promises to God that we make and are unable to keep in the new year are hereby publicly retracted and should not be held against us, right? So we're starting the new year, 10 days into the new year, by saying anything we might say from now until next Yom Kippur, right? Yom Kippurim Ad Yom Kippurim Haba, that we say, and I'm not going to bother singing it, but that's the idea. From this Yom Kippur and next Yom Kippur, if we make any promise using God's name and we can't fulfill it, then we are asking permission for it to be retracted. The power of speech is one of the unique gifts of a human being, a power we share with no other creature. In these rules governing vows and oaths, we see that human beings, like God, have the power to make things holy by words, by proclaiming them holy. By uttering words, an Israelite can impose an obligation on himself or herself as binding as God's commands in the Torah. Hirsch, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, defines a vow, neder, as self-imposed legislation. Like we're making laws for ourselves, saying this is what we are proclaiming that we will do. So, like I said, in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, there's, let me just pull it off the shelf. So within this one volume, which is volume 15 of the traditional 20 volumes of the Talmud, there are 3 words on this volume. One is Sanhedrin. So you have the tractate that deals with courts. And then it's Shavuot, Shevuot, oaths, a whole tractate dealing with that. And then Makot, which are lashes. So there's a whole tractate dealing with that form of punishment of lashes. So the tractate Shavuot, let me just show you how many pages it is. You just see here. This is again the traditional, and we'll get there in the Daf Yomi process. But the tractate itself is this many pages. So it is 98 pages dealing with oaths. So it's something very serious that the rabbis discuss. And again, it's because we're taking God's name in the oath. And we're told in other places in the Torah that desecrating God's name is a capital offense. And that it's an offense that God will execute, not a human court. And so that's why in traditional circles you have some traditional Orthodox Jews will say, "I'll see you at 4 o'clock today, beli neder." That means I'll see you at 4, but without a vow. That is, I'm not taking a vow. Don't understand that I'm taking God's name in making this promise to see you at 4 o'clock. And if I don't show at 4 o'clock, please don't let me be punished by God for not having fulfilled this promise. So it could be something as innocuous as setting up a meeting with somebody to making a pledge to a charitable organization. Some Orthodox Jews will say they'll make the pledge, but they might say beli neder, like God forbid something could happen that I might not be able to follow up on this pledge. And there's so that's one kind of thing that within the Orthodox world today, you kind of reflect this idea of nedarim, vows in modern speech. But in the non-Orthodox world, this is kind of the specifics of the oaths and the vows are kind of foreign to us, but the general principles about how powerful speech can be is not foreign to us, and it's something that we should take very seriously. There's one more comment here about why the leaders of the tribes, because usually when Moses speaks a commandment from God, he's speaking to the entire community of Israel. Why are only the heads of the Israelite tribes spoken to here about these vows? Why doesn't all of Israel have to know about it? And so that's the question below the line. Why are these laws about vows and oaths directed primarily to the heads of the tribes? Because people in high public office are more often tempted to make promises that they cannot keep. And this is the Khatam Sofer, who is from Hungary 150 years ago. So if that was the case of politicians 150 years ago, how much more so it's the case today. And it goes on, their behavior could lessen the respect others have for the spoken word. So I think most people are resigned to the fact that when a politician makes a promise that that it's rare that the politician follows through on the promise, and we take a politician's words with a grain of salt. And that's, that's a sad commentary on American life today, but it's not just in America. It's definitely in Israel, and the way the political system works in Israel too. And I would say it's in every country that has political leaders. It's assumed that the politicians are going to lie. So what the Torah is teaching us is that what is now naively the thought that when somebody speaks, they're actually telling the truth, and you can hold them to their words. And what does that say about society then, when words are just thrown about? And you can even, back to the social media thing, you can even with impunity just be saying awful things about people and get away with it. You can be insulting people. You can even, just the way the world is and the internet is today, you can publish things, so-called publish things on the internet with the thought that anybody who comes across it could see that it's true. Well, if it's published, it must be true. So what does all this mean for society today, for culture today, when words are just bandied about and they're not taken seriously? So it's kind of hard to stand up against this culture today, and to ask people to take their words seriously, to think about what they're saying before they say it. And I mean, that's what the prayer book tells us to do, especially the Machzor on Yom Kippur tells us to do, to think before we speak. And that usually, parents tell their children, if you don't have something nice to say about someone, don't say anything at all, and that doesn't happen anymore. So it's kind of hard today to get these messages across, and you certainly don't get followers on Twitter if you're only saying nice things, except for John Krasinski, when he had his 8 weeks or 10 weeks of what do you call it? SGN, something good network. He had these back from the beginning of the pandemic. some good news. That's what it is. Some good news. So he would only say good things and highlight good things that people were doing for each other. So fortunately, that got a lot of followers, and a lot of people were into it. But you wonder why he stopped. He should, if only he could have kept on going. That's a lot of work to only focus on good, and why do you have to look very hard in a newspaper to see articles or other pieces that focus on good things that people have done for each other? I tend to watch the ABC news, like when it's not when it's originally broadcast, but I usually watch it at 9:30 on Channel 8. And I like how David Muir adds, there's always something good, some good news at the last minute or two of the broadcast. And I don't know if the other networks do that too, but why can't there be more good news like that? And why would society be, or culture be, a little bit better if we focused on good things that people are doing for each other, as opposed to the bad things. So it's something to think about that our portion brings up for us here. There is one other thing. Yes, one other thing that I wanted to bring up from this portion, which kind of highlights, kind of follows up on what we talked about last week with Pinchas. In terms of there with Pinchas, it was one person being a zealot for God and being spontaneous for God. Here, what we have on page 943, the beginning of chapter 31, is this very challenging episode. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, on to 944, avenge the Israelite people on the Midianites, then you shall be gathered to your kin. Right? God is commanding Moses, I want you to wage war on the Midianites, and after that war, it'll be time for you to die. Okay, so we have the whole book of Deuteronomy as his deathbed kind of talk before he dies. So Moses spoke to the people, saying, let men be picked out from among you for a campaign, and let them fall upon Midian to wreak the Lord's vengeance on Midian. You shall dispatch on the campaign 1,000 from every one of the tribes of Israel. So 12,000 people then, I think, except for the tribe of Levi. We're not going to get into all this. But the idea is that I wanted to highlight from just focusing on the beginning. This is a commandment from God to wage war against another people. So we can, on the one hand, we can say, well, God's commanding this because the Torah says so. But on the other hand, if we question who wrote the Torah, then, and if we suggest that people wrote the Torah, then did God make this command? Or did people suggest or claim that God made this command, that that the Israelites waged this war in God's name? And is it right or acceptable to act in God's name in such a violent way like that? Right? So that is the question. So the below the line has us in the last paragraph on the left side on 943. In verse 2, God directs Moses to avenge the Israelite people. In verse 3, however, Moses speaks to the people about the Lord's vengeance. This will not be a war primarily for land or personal gain, but to redeem God's name from the dishonor that the Midianites attached to it at Baal Peor. Back in Pinchas, with that sexual orgy that was happening, this was to avenge God's name for that behavior. Presumably, this is why Pinchas, the priest, is listed as leading the effort rather than Joshua. Had we been idol worshipers, they would not have striven so hard to lead us astray. So in other words, this is Pinchas is leading this war effort as an act of vengeance and to follow up on his personal act of zealotry. The reader is likely, this is what I wanted to highlight, the reader is likely to be uncomfortable with the notion of a holy war, which in Muslim culture is jihad, right? So the Muslims have holy war, we have holy war. Does placing the seal of religious approval on a military undertaking change and sanctify the battle, or does it compromise the religion and contaminate it with the stain of bloodshed? When is war the Lord's vengeance, and when is it human vengeance to which the name of God has been attached? So fascinating that the commentary leaves that as a question for us to ponder, right? So how is it appropriate to attach God's name to religious actions that we undertake? It's one thing to do something good in God's name. It's quite another to do something violent in God's name and claim that God insisted and commanded this be done. So I think of the Jewish terrorist on Purim, Baruch Goldstein, who claimed in God's name the right to enter the mosque that was in the cave of the patriarchs and matriarchs in Hebron on Purim Day, on Purim, which is about revenge against the Persian plot and Haman's plot to kill the Jews, to go on Purim and kill Muslims in the mosque, and to claim that he did so in God's name. So that's an individual act of vengeance, as opposed to, you could argue, those who settle in what is now known as the West Bank and Gaza, to claim that it's in God's name that they are settling that area of the biblical land of Israel, because God commanded and set out the boundaries in the Torah for what the land of Israel would be, and it is their God-given right. These Jewish settlers will say, and by saying settler, I'm not necessarily being opposed to that position. I'm just saying that they live in those areas of the biblical land of Israel. They do so in God's name, and acting out the prophetic impulse that someday we will return to the entire land of Israel. So is that appropriate to do that in God's name? And is it an appropriate counter argument to give up the land of Israel in God's name to make peace? So this is challenging and provocative when God enters into human affairs in this way. When God enters politics, when God enters into geography, when God enters into military strategy, it kind of raises everything to another level that is spiritually and religiously provocative. And I would argue that God has no place in that. What place God has is in teaching us the appropriate moral, ethical, and religious principles by which we lead our lives. God is not supposed to be there saying we are waging this war in God's name. That, I think, is Chilul Hashem, desecrating God's name, because who are we to have the chutzpah to say that we know exactly what God wants us to do, and that we know that God wants us to wage war right now? That is religious chutzpah, and that is not right. But there are many in the traditional Orthodox circles in the Jewish community, especially in Israel, in the state of Israel today, who have no problem doing what they do and saying that they're doing it in God's name. So that's the challenge that chapter 31 has for us. And on the one hand, you can understand how people might claim to say that God said these words, but did God really command this? That's a question that we'll have to that we can't answer, because if we say God commanded this, then that opens up one whole can of worms. If we say that God did not say any of the Torah, that opens up a different can of worms in terms of how our ancestors acted in the past and what is expected of us in the future. So, if anybody doesn't have any questions or comments, I'd like to end here for today, because there is something at 12 o'clock that I want to try to get onto. So I want to wish everybody a good rest of the day. We have Minyan this evening at 7:30 if you want to join, and I will be sending out information momentarily about the funeral for Zelma Fink, which will be tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.